Okay, let's unpack this. When an accident happens, how does the law actually decide if someone was, at fault? We're not talking intentional stuff like trespass or battery here.
Yeah.
We are diving straight into the cornerstone of civil liability, the tort of negligence. And to really get liability here, we need to move past duty and nail down that crucial second element, the standard of care. What level of conduct exactly does the law demand from you to, well, avoid getting sued successfully?
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how this whole idea of fault shifted over time. I mean, we started with something closer to strict liability, think old school writs like trespass, right? But then around the mid-1800s, we moved to this modern fault-based system. So today, proving negligence means ticking off 6 boxes: duty, standard of care, breach, cause and fact, proximate cause, or scope of liability and damages. Our whole focus today really is just on that measure of the duty owed, the standard of care. We got to figure out what yardstick the law uses to judge behavior and when, if ever, that yardstick might bend a little.
All right, so let's start with that main yardstick then. What is the general rule for the standard of care? And maybe more importantly, why did the law decide against a totally subjective measure? One that looks at what this specific person could actually do, given their own intellect or limits.
Okay, the general rule is that the defendant has to act as a reasonably prudent person would act in the same or similar circumstances. And crucially, this is an objective standard, completely objective. It looks at your conduct measured against this external sort of community benchmark. It deliberately ignores your personal subjective limitations. Maybe you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, or you don't have lightning fast reflexes. It doesn't matter for the standard itself.
Huh. That does sound a bit harsh, doesn't it? Why push for objectivity if someone genuinely, did their best?
Well, there are 3 really powerful policy reasons behind it. First, just pure administration. A subjective standard. It'd be impossible to manage. Think about it. Infinite shades of ability, intelligence. How could a court possibly measure that consistently? Second, there's a compensation rationale. The thinking is often that those likely to cause harm, even if subjectively blameless, should be the ones to pay for the damage caused to an innocent plaintiff. And third, it's about fairness to the community. People around you, your neighbors, they have a right to expect a certain minimum level of safe behavior. Justice Holmes had that great line, your personal defects might be forgiven in the courts of heaven, but down here, your neighbors need you to meet their standard.
That community minimum idea clicks, yeah. But it's also interesting historically that this reasonable person wasn't always a person, right? It used to be the reasonable man.
Exactly right. And critics like Professor Leslie Bender have pointed out pretty persuasively that even after we change the words to reasonable person, some of those underlying assumptions, those norms, well, they still carried latent gender bias. They often didn't account for women's experiences or ways of judging risk. But setting aside that really important critique for a moment, the objective nature of the standard itself, that's firmly stuck in common law.
Okay, to see this objectivity in action, let's rewind to the classic case that really set this standard, Vaughn v. Menlove. The facts are kind of memorable. Guy named Vaughn, he piles up hay near his neighbor's cottage, warns him it might catch fire, it does catch fire, neighbor's cottage burns down. Vaughn's whole defense was basically, look, I'm not the brightest bulb, but I honestly thought I was being careful enough. I did my best.
Right. He was essentially asking the court, judge me by my limited smarts and my good intentions, not by some external ideal of prudence.
Okay, let's analyze Vaughn v. Menlove. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
So the defendant, Menlove, piled hay, rick of hay, on his land near the plaintiff Vaughn's cottages. Vaughn repeatedly warned him it was dangerous, a fire risk. Menlove ignored him. The hay eventually overheated and spontaneously combusted, burning down Vaughn's cottages. Menlove's defense was he shouldn't be liable if he acted honestly and bona fide to the best of his own judgment, even if that judgment wasn't great.
And what was the core legal issue before the court?
The big question was, is the standard for negligence liability based on the defendant's own individual subjective belief and judgment, or is it based on an external objective standard of caution that the community expects?
What rule did the court ultimately apply?
The court went with the objective standard. It required the defendant to use the level of caution that a man of ordinary prudence would observe.
And what was the court's analysis? How did they justify that?
Their reasoning was pretty clear. They said liability can't just depend on each person's individual judgment, because that would be, and this is the famous quote, as variable as the length of the foot of each individual. Chaos, right? They emphasized that this external standard is crucial to protect everyone's right to expect a basic level of care from others.
And the conclusion?
Menlove was found liable. His conduct simply fell below that external objective benchmark of a reasonably prudent person. Didn't matter that he sincerely thought he was doing okay. The RPP standard sets a minimum floor. It doesn't just reflect the individual's capacity.
Okay, so objective is the baseline. But here's where it gets really interesting. Like you said, the standard is the RPP under the same or similar circumstances. So where does the law make allowances? Let's start with physical conditions. Does the law actually expect a blind person to see or a deaf person to hear?
No, thankfully, the law is more sensible there. Physical conditions are generally taken into account. Why? Because they're usually tangible, you can measure them, verify them. So, the defendant is held to the standard of care of a reasonable person dealing with that same disability. But, and this is a key contrast, think about voluntary intoxication. That can feel physical, right? But someone who chooses to get drunk isn't judged against a reasonable drunk person standard. Nope. They have to perform just as well as a reasonably prudent sober person. No discount for voluntary impairment.
Let's look at Roberts v. State of Louisiana, see how this physical disability thing works. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay, in Roberts, the defendant was blind since birth. He worked in a concession stand in a public building. He was walking from the stand towards the restroom, not using a cane or guide dog, just sort of shuffling along familiar territory. And he bumped into the plaintiff, an older man who fell and got injured. The plaintiff sued for negligence.
And what was the core legal issue here?
The issue was, what standard of care should apply to a defendant who has a physical disability, specifically blindness, when that disability is directly related to how the injury occurred?
What rule did the court apply in that situation?
The court said the jury has to judge the defendant's conduct by comparing him to a reasonably prudent blind person under the same or similar circumstances.
Okay, and what was the court's analysis? How did they flesh that out?
Well, they recognized the physical reality of his blindness, but they said the law still expects him to take the precautions that a reasonable person who is blind would take. So maybe that means using a cane, maybe relying more on hearing, maybe moving more slowly. The court also pointed out, importantly, that sometimes a disability might require even greater care in certain situations, or it might mean you just can't do certain activities at all, like obviously a blind person driving a car.
And the conclusion on Roberts?
The defendant's conduct had to be judged against that standard of a reasonable blind person. This means the jury could still find him negligent, right? If they decided that a reasonable blind person would have taken more precautions in that specific situation, like using a cane in that lobby, even though he couldn't literally see the plaintiff.
That flexibility for physical limits seems, well, reasonable. But then we hit this wall when we move from the physical to the mental. That flexibility just seems to vanish. If we adjust for blindness, why is the rule so starkly different from mental conditions, like, say, low intelligence or even diagnosed insanity?
Yeah, that's exactly where the harshness of the objective standard really bites, and it's frankly a constant point of debate and criticism. Almost universally, U.S. courts say that mental disability, whether it's low IQ, psychosis, clinical insanity, it's completely irrelevant to negligence liability. The law just pretends the reasonable person is always sane and possesses average intelligence.
But hang on. If tort law is supposed to be about fault, isn't that the whole point of moving away from strict liability? How can we ethically hold someone liable for, say, a severe permanent cognitive deficit they literally cannot control? Is the law basically just admitting here, look, compensating the victim matters more than finding true subjective fault?
You've absolutely nailed the core ethical tension there. The law pretty much does admit that this rule can be deeply unfair to the defendant with cognitive challenges. But the objective rule wins out because of those practical administrative reasons we talked about earlier. Mental states are seen as too hard to measure reliably, maybe too easy to fake in court, And yes, ultimately, the goal of making the innocent, injured plaintiff whole often takes precedence over the subjective situation of the defendant. It's precisely because this rule feels so harsh that we sometimes see courts try to carve out tiny exceptions, which brings us, inevitably, to the completely unforgettable facts of the Batman case.
Ah, yes, the Batman case. This has to be Broening v. American Family Insco. The defendant driver sees a white light, gets convinced God has grabbed the steering wheel, and floors it because, quote, she needs to fly because Batman does it. Okay, let's analyze Broening v. American Family Insco. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Right. So the plaintiff, Broening, was driving his truck. The defendant, Veith, insured by American Family, was driving her car and suddenly crossed the center line, hitting him head on. Why? Because she experienced a sudden, powerful paranoid delusion. She literally thought God was directing her car and that she could press the accelerator and fly like Batman. Crucially, she had experienced some prior, maybe less intense delusions before this incident.
And what was the core legal issue the court had to wrestle with?
The big question was, can a defendant use sudden, unexpected insanity or a mental delusion as a defense against the objective, reasonable person standard? Basically, can you avoid liability if you were suddenly mentally incapacitated without warning?
What rule did the court apply?
Yeah.
Did they stick to the traditional harsh rule?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. The Wisconsin Supreme Court actually signaled a potential, albeit very narrow, break from tradition. They said the general rule holding the mentally ill to a sane standard might be too broad if, and this is the key, the driver is suddenly overcome without forewarning by a mental disability that makes it impossible for them to conform their conduct to the reasonable person standard. They drew an analogy to a sudden, unforeseeable physical event like a heart attack at the wheel.
Okay, so they opened the door a crack. What was the court's analysis then? Did the defendant get off the hook?
Not in this case. Even though the court acknowledged this theoretical possibility of a sudden, unforeseeable mental lapse being a defense, they ultimately upheld the jury's verdict for the plaintiff. Why? Because the jury could have reasonably found that the defendant did have some prior notice or warning based on her previous delusions. That negated the without forewarning part of their potential exception. If you know you're prone to delusions, maybe reasonable care requires you not to drive or to take other precautions.
And the conclusion?
The bottom line. The traditional rule mentally disabled defendants are held to the objective standard of a sane person pretty much prevailed here. Bräunig carved out this very narrow potential exception for sudden, unforeseeable onset, but because the defendant's condition was arguably foreseeable to her, she was still found liable. It's an exception that rarely succeeds in practice. Now, we should probably quickly touch on two other ways. The same or similar circumstances part of the RPP standard gets modified or interpreted. That's superior skill and emergency situations.
Right. So what if you're not limited, but actually better than average? Say you're a super experienced, highly skilled truck driver. Are you held to a higher standard than just the regular reasonable driver? And how does the whole circumstances thing play out if you're suddenly thrown into a crisis?
Okay, for superior skill, technically, the legal standard of care doesn't change. You're still judged against the reasonably prudent person. It's not like there's a reasonably prudent expert trucker standard. The RPP is the minimum expected of everyone in the community. However, the defendant's special knowledge, extra skill, superior abilities, those are considered part of the circumstances. They become relevant when the jury decides the breach question. The law expects the reasonable person to use all the knowledge and skills they actually possess. So, yes, that highly experienced trucker must use their superior skill reasonably. If they don't, they've breached the RPP standard.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about emergency situations?
Here, the jury is allowed to consider evidence that the defendant was acting under emergency conditions, provided the emergency wasn't something the defendant created themselves. Again, the standard doesn't change, it's still the RPP, but the circumstances are now an emergency. So, the question becomes, how would a reasonable person act in that emergency predicament? The restatement defines an emergency pretty tightly. It has to be sudden, unexpected, requiring a decision in a very short time, something outside the actor's usual experience.
Yeah, the classic case for that is Torts v. Peerless Transport, isn't it? The taxi driver whose cab gets hijacked by a gunman, he jumps out of the moving cab to save himself, and the empty cab runs wild and injures someone. He definitely caused the injury by jumping out, but was he negligent?
Exactly, and the court basically said, look, the level of judgment you can expect from someone with a gun pointed at them is way different than normal. Errors in judgment made in the heat and terror of that moment don't count against him, as long as he didn't cause the emergency himself. To call him negligent for trying to save his own life, the court famously said, would be to brand him coward. The emergency became part of the circumstances the reasonable person was judged within.
All right, finally, let's shift gears completely and talk about the child standard. Kids are treated totally differently, aren't they? Why is the standard for a child defendant so much more subjective compared to the adult RPP?
Yes, Totally different approach. Most places compare a child's conduct to that of other children of the same age, experience, and intelligence acting under similar circumstances. Notice how subjective that is: age, experience, intelligence. It explicitly lets the jury consider the specific child's actual qualities. Maybe they have below average intelligence for their age, or they haven't had much experience with the world. Things we strictly ignore for adults. Why? It comes from this basic societal understanding that kids just don't have the judgment, the foresight, the risk assessment ability we expect from adults.
But there's a big catch, right? A major exception where kids are suddenly held to that stricter adult standard. What kind of activity triggers that switch?
That's right. Many courts will snap back to the fully objective adult RPP standard if the child was engaged in what's called an adult activity. This almost always includes operating motorized vehicles. Think cars, motorcycles, motorboats, sometimes snowmobiles. Some courts might broaden it slightly to other inherently dangerous activities typically done by adults. The idea is, if you're playing in the adult world with adult machines, you play by adult rules for safety.
Let's look at Delwo v. Pearson to see exactly where that line gets drawn. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay, in Dello, we had a 12-year-old kid, the defendant, operating a motorboat with an outboard motor on a lake. While driving the boat, he crossed behind the plaintiff's fishing boat, and his motor caught the plaintiff's fishing line. This yanked the fishing rod, injuring the plaintiff's eye.
And what was the core legal issue for the court?
The central question was, should this 12-year-old operating a powerful motorboat be judged by the more lenient subjective child standard of care, or should he be held to the objective standard expected of adult boat operators?
What rule did the court decide to apply?
The court adopted the rule that when a minor participates in an activity that is normally undertaken only by adults, and especially one for which adult qualifications like licensing might be required, even if not for that specific boat, the minor will be held to the same objective adult standard of care.
And what was the court's analysis behind that? Why treat him like an adult here?
They reasoned that operating a motorboat isn't typical child's play. It's an adult activity with significant risks. When a child engages in something like that, the public interacts with them often without knowing they're dealing with a child. People on the water can't be expected to anticipate or constantly guard against the potential lack of judgment common in kids operating powerful machines. So the court prioritized protecting the public from the risks inherent in these adult-type activities.
And the conclusion in Dello.
The 12-year-old boat operator was held to the objective reasonable person standard, the adult standard. His conduct would be judged not against what a reasonable 12-year-old would do, but what a reasonable adult boat operator would do. Public safety trumped the child's age in this context. Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, you can see the reasonable person standard is kind of this flexible idea hiding inside what looks like a rigid rule. To really master this for analyzing negligence problems, say, on an exam, here's the diagnostic checklist you need to run through every time you spot a standard of care issue. 1. Start with the default. Is the defendant an adult? If yes, your baseline is the objective reasonable person standard acting in the same or similar circumstances. Remember, this standard already assumes average intelligence and sanity, no automatic adjustment for low IQ or mental illness here. 2. Check for physical modifications. Does the defendant have a physical disability? Blind, deaf, missing limb? If yes, you adjust. The standard becomes the reasonable person with that like disability. Big exception here. Voluntary intoxication gets no adjustment. Still held to the sober RPP standard. 3. Check for mental modifications. Does the defendant have low intelligence or a diagnosed mental disability or insanity? Generally, no adjustment is allowed. They're held to the standard of a sane person with normal intelligence. The only tiny crack in that wall is if you're in a rare jurisdiction that recognizes the Browning exception for a sudden, completely unforeseeable mental incapacity. Very rare. 4. Check for superior abilities. Does the defendant have special skills, training, or knowledge beyond the average person? The standard itself doesn't go up. It stays RPP minimum. But the jury must consider whether the defendant reasonably used those superior skills they possess when deciding if they breached the standard. 5. Check for emergency. Was the defendant genuinely faced with a sudden emergency that they didn't create? If yes, the jury evaluates their conduct against the standard of a reasonable person in that specific emergency predicament. 6. Check for age. Is the defendant a child? If yes, first consider the child standard. Compare their conduct to a child of like age, experience, and intelligence. Highly subjective. But then check the adult activity exception. Was the child engaged in an adult activity, usually involving motorized vehicles or inherently dangerous stuff? If yes, forget the child standard and revert back to the objective adult reasonable person standard.
Wow, that checklist really lays it out. It shows just how many different factors the law tries to juggle under this single kind of mythical figure of the reasonable person. It definitely sacrifices individual fairness for predictability sometimes. So maybe here's the final thought to chew on. As our understanding of things like neuroscience and mental health gets deeper, giving us real insight into genuine, unchangeable cognitive differences, well, can a tort system that claims it's based on fault ethically keep ignoring those realities? Is this reasonable person standard still doing justice? Or is it mostly just serving, administrative convenience? Something to think about next time you bump into this reasonable person concept out there.